This is O'Hare International Airport at the farthest edge of the city limits of Chicago. At the top left-hand corner of the picture, you can see, running from a half cloverleaf, the beginning of a loop of the John F. Kennedy Expressway, which covers a 17 miles southeast into the city centre. O'Hare is the busiest airport in the world, and road traffic for Chicago is therefore heavy. This program is concerned with transport for the simple reason that it is movement, the daily ebb and flow of people and traffic, that knits the social areas and the functional zones of the metropolis, like the central business district, into an integrated whole. More than this, movement is achieved by car and truck. And that's why we've decided to spend most of this program dealing with one aspect of transport that allows the maximization of the use of vehicles in the urban area, the urban motorway. Such motorways not only increase accessibility within the city, for example between the suburbs and the central business district, but they reinforce the normal tendency for central areas to be zones of the highest urban land values and thus greatest intensity of use, as these skyscrapers bear witness. The contribution of the expressways has had a profound effect on the land values of those areas which lie adjacent to them, and thus the way in which that land is actually used. To find out about the planning philosophy of the expressway system in Chicago, I spoke to Milton Bukarski, Commissioner of Public Works for the city.
Well, in the late 1950s, a law was passed in the United States Congress which provided for a highway trust fund, which funded a 41,000-mile interstate highway program, considered a defense highway program. And in order to find out where the best system would be, a study was undertaken called the Chicago Area Transportation Study, which addressed the entire region and developed an area of need of various transportation corridors. The John F. Kennedy Expressway was one of those corridors and was to serve Chicago O'Hare International Airport.
Now, apart from the general point you've just made, could I ask you what factors particularly guided the planning of this expressway?
Well, as far as the factors were concerned, a generator of persons and terminus points were, on the one hand, the airport, and on the other end was the center of the city of Chicago, the central business district. And the attempts to provide intersectional improvements along the way to make an adequate connection for people to get on the system and to go either to the downtown area or to the airport was really the prime consideration. Mobility really is one of the reasons for the affluence of this nation, and that any nation who has the ability of moving goods, moving people, having a concentration of effort and accessibility to other locations, be it for recreational, for work, for school, education, provides for a better environment and a better society.
The characteristics of the Kennedy Expressway are equally attributable to the rest of the expressway system in Chicago. But how does this system relate spatially to the metropolitan area as a whole? Here we are talking not just about the land within the city limits governed by City Hall, that area which you can see here in outline, but about the total built-up area. And so we can see the way in which the complete expressway system links the central business district, that area of the city which demands maximum accessibility, with the rest of that total urban area. The Kennedy runs, as we've seen, from O'Hare Airport to the central business district. Immediately outside the central business district, this expressway cut through what was the old inner industrial area of the city. Have a look at the type and intensity of land use here. As you can see, factories still remain. Some have been renovated and partially rebuilt, but they come right up to the edge of the expressway simply because the thoroughfare is relatively new and unrelated to the land use pattern which predates it. These factories are interspersed with residential development, mostly dating from the interwar years, but some infilling with newer apartments. These infillings come about as a result of rising land values and greater accessibility, in turn a result of the impact of the expressway.
We conducted some before and after studies in depth, and we find that any expressway has a marked effect on land values for a distance approximating 2 miles either side of the highway, and that increases in land values within this 4-mile strip have exceeded the normal inflationary increases of land values throughout the area. And within the 4-mile strip, the area adjacent to the expressway, in other words, at the 0 distance from the center, increased at a far more rapid rate than that 2 miles away from the center. And this includes populated area and built-up areas where we went to undeveloped areas that became nearer to the center of the city by virtue of the fact that transportation was more rapid, that some of the gains were phenomenal. They were as many as 20 and 30 times the value of the land before.
Let's look at the sort of study which is often used to assess rises in land value. The one we're going to examine now was carried out by the Chicago Area Transportation Study. They chose to consider 2 areas. One was a test zone located astride the expressway. The control area was in fact in 2 parts, to the west and the north of the Kennedy. During an 8-year period, starting 2 years before the land was acquired and extending 2 years after the expressway was opened, values in the test and control areas rose by 100% and by 79% respectively. But within these overall totals, differences could be identified according to particular land usage. The study looked at industrial, commercial and residential land value increases. You'll notice that in this study, industrial land underwent a higher increase in the control area than in the test area right on the expressway. This is not what we should expect, and in fact the authors of the report feel they need to explain it. Industrial development in the control areas, they say, is further out from the city centre, is thus of more recent construction, and therefore susceptible to larger increases, bearing in mind the tendency for industry to vacate the inner core of the city. To find out about general patterns of land value increases along the whole length of the expressway, I spoke to a land valuer and vice chairman of the Chicago Plan Commission, Miles Berger.
Well, the Kennedy Expressway is somewhat unique in the sense that you find every type of land use along it, residential, both multifamily, single-family, commercial, shopping, and industrial. In going through the residential districts that it went through, there was no major effect because a good part of the Kennedy system is in the central city. And so there was no major effect in terms of land values. When we got to the industrial areas, as I just mentioned, there was certainly a significant increment over the 10 to 12 years that the Kennedy has been in existence now. As the Kennedy turns and goes northwest to O'Hare Field, we see the most significant increments in land value, some in residential, but more particularly in the commercial and hotel properties that have been developed in conjunction with the center that O'Hare Field has created, the center of activity, I should say, that O'Hare Field has created. Land values at, for instance, Cumberland and the Kennedy Expressway, approximately a mile east of the airport, have gone from, in 1955, $3,000 to $5,000 an acre, to 1960, at the time the expressway was being built, at $15,000 to $20,000 an acre, and presently for the higher density use properties are in the $500,000 to $600,000 category per acre. That's been the most dramatic increment, part of which of course is attributable to the emphasis in the O'Hare Field complex, and part of which to inflation, but also a good part of it to the Kennedy Expressway itself.
Do you find, though, that in an area like this particular expressway where we are now, that land values perhaps drop a bit along either side of the expressway to build up perhaps a mile or two distant from it?
Well, that's particularly true of the residential areas. When you go through an established residential district, land values immediately to the either side of the expressway that are residential in nature usually drop a little or stagnate. It also depends upon the characteristics of the area. For instance, on the Eisenhower Expressway, where it ran through several blighted and older areas of the city of Chicago, there's been no movement one way or the other. There's been no increment in value. Land values were low at the time, and the expressway did not serve to increment values at all. On the Kennedy Expressway, on the other hand, as we got into the newer areas, directly to the east of the airport and then to the west of the airport, going out toward Palatine, Mount Prospect, those areas, they opened up entire communities. Now, the land values immediately adjacent to the expressway in this instance that were zoned for commercial or industrial experienced significant rises. The residential immediately adjacent to the expressway, in most instances, either declined or stagnated. However, within a mile, 2 or 3 mile zones of the expressway access, residential mushroomed in value.
By way of contrast with the Kennedy, which, for much of its length, was built through old developed land with high-intensity usage, our second example, the Edens Expressway, running off Kennedy here, passes through land of a very different character. Going north on Kennedy, we can turn onto the Edens Expressway at this intersection. Here, the contrast in land use on either side of the road is at once apparent. The edge of this highway is landscaped. Carefully laid out car parks lie next to factories which bear a planned relationship to the expressway itself. Open space and parklands lie between the expressway and new housing estates. Even where new houses do approach Edens behind the landscape verge, they are built at a low density and reflect the more recent demands for higher living standards. This is in strong contrast with Kennedy. And factories here of the newer, cleaner, technologically based kind clearly have little in common with those we saw bordering the Kennedy Expressway. Now let's look at the Chicago Area Transportation Study for Edens. Again, the test area lay across the highway, but the control was in one block to the east. Over a period of 24 years, starting 2 years before the land was acquired, values in the test area rose by 293%, and in the control, 70%. This time, differences in land value increases for all three categories of land use were very marked. I asked Andrew Plummer of the organization that prepared the study if he would like to compare the changing land values along Edens with those of Kennedy.
As far as land values go, there is no basic difference between the two, except that the Kennedy went through areas of much higher intensity development. So you might say that the cost, the value of the land per acre or per half acre is greater because the development was much more intense. That's the basic difference. There was a lot more development and a lot more intense development in the area that the Kennedy went through. This has, of course, meant that the change in the value of the land has not been nearly as great as it was when the Edens was built, because the land along the Edens was vacant for the most part. This expressway was open to traffic in 1951. It was one of the first expressways in the region, and it was built in virtually open land. The land consisted of farms and abandoned subdivisions that were put together during the 30s, and because of the Depression were never developed. This land right now in some instances has increased in value by 750%. It's interesting to note that the types of development basically that develop in any area are industrial, commercial, and residential, and they have increased in percentage-wise approximately with the industrial having the greatest increase, the commercial next, and the residential secondly. It's also apparent from an expressway construction like this that the development that takes place does not necessarily increase in a set pattern as you go away from the expressway. The pattern is dependent on a number of things, one of which is the amount of construction that already existed when the expressway was in, and another factor is the fact that whether the expressway is landscaped. By this I mean that if the expressway is landscaped, the cost or the value of the homes or the property immediately adjacent to the expressway has no particular difference from the cost of or the value of the land a couple of blocks away. Now, when the expressway is not of this type, when the development is very intensive on the existing right-of-way, then the value of the land immediately adjacent to the expressway does have less value than a couple of blocks away.
Because Edens was built largely through agricultural land, the development of land use in an interdependent way is very apparent compared with Kennedy. Here we have the growth of residential areas using the expressway as a high accessibility route. We have the influx of new technological industries, providing some white-collar, localized employment. But much of the development of a commercial kind is in the form of shopping precincts, designed to meet the needs of the new residential areas along the expressway. Andrew Plummer and I decided to look at one particular new development along Edens Expressway, the Edens Plaza Shopping Precinct. Placed right next to an expressway access point in the form of a cloverleaf junction, this consists of a number of shops developed in conjunction with a large car parking area and surrounded by ancillary services such as offices, petrol stations, and so on. This aerial shot highlights the close interconnection between the expressway, the shopping precinct, and part of the residential area.
The basic structure that we're about now is a shopping center. It's not the dominant type of development in the area. The dominant type of development is, of course, residential, but the shopping center is here because of the residential development. It's also here because of its access to the expressway, which is immediately adjacent to the shopping center. It's hard to tell which comes first. I think that you would have to assume that for the most part the residence comes first, and when enough people are there to service the place and keep the retail businesses at a level where they can afford to operate, then they're built.
I'd be very interested to know a bit more about the detail of a shopping precinct like this. Now, what about the national grocery stores way behind us?
All right.
What's that function?
Well, the function of the national is to provide, as is fairly obvious, a large grocery selection for the people that come to use the shopping center, with the grocery store just being another item to attract them to a focal point of different type of retail activities.
This is absolutely typical, is it, of all these out-of-town shopping centers?
That is correct. You will find a grocery store of some size in every shopping center.
Well, now, what about Carson's?
Carson's is an old Chicago store. It started right around after the Chicago fire, and along with a number of other stores that had their origins in the Loop, they now have satellite establishments in the suburban area in shopping centers.
Yes. Is this very much a sort of prestige thing to do, to keep their name before the public eye?
No.
I mean, I would have thought that people would still go into the central business district if they wanted to shop for clothes and things like
Well,
that.
they do, and I believe the selection, you would have to say the selection is still the best in the Loop.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's more than prestige. I think it's economics, the reason they're out there in the suburban area. It's just the fact that there are so many people in the suburban area now compared to the amount of people that were out here before, that they
Yes.
have to have the facilities out where the people are. It's
Quite.
simply the reason they're out here.
And land values are obviously lower, and it enables them to develop the nature of their enterprise, presumably at a fairly reasonable cost.
That's correct. I don't think that they've ever considered doing any more building in the Chicago central area at all, simply because of the cost of the land.
Yes. Well, now, what else have we got here? What other sorts of function do you expect to find in a shopping center like Eaton's Plaza?
Well, usually what you have are a number of service oriented types of establishments in addition to the major store. There's also usually stores of a different variety, possibly selling some of the same goods, but providing the people that come to the shopping center with that alternative of buying it at Carson's or buying it at Woolworth's or some other store.
Yeah, so there's a built-in element of competition out here with the various sorts of stores that they've got. You do have alternatives.
That's correct.
You're not just stuck with one.
That's correct. That, I think, is typical of the shopping centers, that they provide some type of alternative to the different items that can be purchased. And they provide some type of service. There's usually a cleaner's. There's very often a barber shop, and this kind of thing that, again, attracts people to make the alternate choices at the different establishments.
We've seen in this program something of the impact on the urban fabric of Chicago of just two expressways which form part of its radial network. These expressways provide increasing accessibility for the central business area, but in their contrasting ways have changed along their length two major features of the urban dynamic: land values and land use. 2 points, however, remain to be emphasized. First, the urban expressway system is just one, though perhaps the most important, part of a total transport network in the urban area. Secondly, in concerning ourselves as we have with expressways inside the urban area, we mustn't forget their function as part of a system which provides access throughout the whole region. In fact, 80% of the traffic using the expressways in the central area has no destination within that area, but in the rest of the region beyond.